Hi guys, this week's SSV has to do with herbivory in Yellowstone National Park. It's about trophic cascades and the consequences of herbivory on plant communities on a large scale. And this was done by Ripple and Beschta in 2003. So a little background, we start the story with riparian plant communities. These are plant communities that grow alongside water sources. Primarily rivers is what's thought of in terms of riparian communities. And sometimes these communities have a very hard time of establishing or regenerating after either disturbances, changes in the weather, climate, and or herbivory. And so this story takes place in Yellowstone National Park, which is huge. It's close to the size of Santa Barbara County. It's an incredibly biodiverse and quite pristine national park. And in Yellowstone National Park, what scientists were observing is that along these riparian zones, the deciduous plant species were having a really tough time. They were really in poor condition. They were very small in stature, and they weren't reaching reproductive size, so they weren't able to reproduce and spread. And so there were a lot of different potential causes, but one of the consensus that came out is that some scientists hypothesized that the lack of wolves was to blame. And this is kind of a crazy theory if you think about it. Why would wolves influence woody plants? Well, wolves had been extirpated, so that's local extinction, if you will, from 1872 to 1926. So they were killed off, excluded, etc. So they had also been absent from the park all the way through 1995. So the park had been wolfless for a very long time. And it was decided to reintroduce them in around 95, 96 from Canada. They were reintroduced from Jasper National Park through a collaboration of US and Canadian officials. So ultimately, why would wolves influence riparian vegetation? Well, wolves are part of a trophic cascade for this ecosystem, especially in Yellowstone National Park. They prey upon the elk, which are one of the main herbivores of the system, and elk are primarily browsers. Browsers are herbivores that eat woody plants, and they consumed a lot of the plants that grew along these riparian zones. And so it was theorized that a trophic cascade was occurring in Yellowstone National Park with top-down control by the wolves. And so, because there were no wolves up to that point, there was nothing preventing the elk from devastating the riparian vegetation. So these scientists decided to ask, how does this riparian vegetation respond to wolf reintroduction? Specifically, cottonwoods is what they were studying, which was one of the dominant plants along the riparian corridors. And basically, what are the potential effects of this trophic cascade? So what is the indirect effect of predators on plants in Yellowstone National Park? Their hypothesis was based on the ecology of fear. This is this theory where high risk of predation, so not necessarily direct consumption of wolves on elk, but the fear that wolves induce in elk populations will alter their distribution and their behavior. So the hypothesis is that high risk leads to more growth. So elk will avoid areas where they are at risk of predation, which reduces herbivory and benefits plant growth. On the contrary, other places that have low risk of predation will not be inhibited, or will not inhibit browsing by elk upon these cottonwoods. So there will be little or no change in these places with low risk. Now, how did they do this? Their study site was in the Lamar Valley, which is in the northeast corner of Yellowstone National Park. Just as a side note, I actually spent a whole summer working in where this orange star is. I was based there and did a lot of surveys and vegetation work in Yellowstone National Park. Feel free to ask me about it later. And the data that they took was, they took photographs. So there were photographs taken from some of these areas prior to the introduction, and then they retook them after the introduction to see if there's any change. And then they took some quantifiable data, so they measured the height of cottonwoods to look at growth inhibition, or potential growth inhibition. And they also measured the percent of plants that were browsed by herbivores. So how much of these plants was actively being consumed by herbivores, specifically elk. And these are the results. So the results in terms of photographs were quite stark. So this is a photograph of a high-risk site. So remember, this is not direct consumption by wolf, but just the potential for wolf predation. This photo on top was taken in 1991. The second one was in 2002. And remember, the wolf reintroduction was around 95, 96. So about halfway between this photo. And there's quite an obvious change in the vegetation size along this riparian corridor. And this is another noteworthy photo taken in 97 and 2001. The first one was taken a year after the introduction, but there's quite a big difference in plant recovery as the herbivores changed their behavior based on this new predation threat. So overall, in these high-risk sites, herbivory was reduced, and there was regeneration of cottonwoods and other vegetation. So there was a net benefit for the plants at these high-risk sites. On the contrary, low-risk sites, so where there was not much threat of predation, didn't change much. There seemed to be a continued suppression of riparian vegetation by browsing. You can see in this photo in 94 and 2002, there's really not that much difference in terms of plant height or plant growth. And these visual observations were reflected in the data that these researchers collected. So these are a set of graphs on your left. On your x-axis you have the dates of the surveys, and on your y-axis you have either browse percent or the height of the plants in centimeters. And so here's in the blue box we have the low-risk sites. So you can see that in the black bars there was plenty of browsing going on. There's lots of herbivory, and there's very little change in height. So these plants weren't getting any taller at the low-risk sites. Now, at the high-risk sites, the story was a little bit different. So there was a really large reduction in browsing at one of the sites, and the other site just didn't have much browsing to begin with. But what really changed was the height of the plants. So these plants got taller. And what's important about plants getting tall, which is in dealing with browsing, is that when plants reach a certain height, you are above browsing pressure. So elk can only reach so high when they're eating leaves. If plants grow high enough, they can escape this browsing pressure and no longer have any threat of herbivory. So this is a big deal when it comes to plant growth, is getting away from that herbivore pressure. So ultimately, what does this mean? Well, this means that there is top-down predator control of herbivores in Yellowstone National Park, and that this herbivory by elk can have immense consequences for this environment. It can not only change a plant species distribution and potentially age and size class distribution, but possibly have really big indirect effects on large-scale processes. You can imagine the cascade of different impacts that this change in vegetation could have. You could have changes to nutrient cycling, you can have changes to flooding regimes, a whole host of different factors could be altered by this change in herbivory, just from reintroducing a top predator. And so that's the story. Kind of the little conclusion to it all. The wolves are doing great. There's 98 wolves currently and 10 different packs. This is a map of the packs in 2011. And if you're really still interested, there's a hour-long documentary on YouTube that's quite interesting. Alrighty, have a good one.